Begun, the Clone Wars have, as Atari Archive looks at the next tranche of releases from games by Apollo. Apollo has only been producing video games since December, but has extremely rapidly scaled up over that 6-month period due to the desires of company president Pat Roper and the success of their January release, Space Chase. That game was created by Ed Selvo, who developed it as a contractor for Apollo, and was responsible for their first game, Skeet Shoot, as an independent developer. According to a 2006 interview with Scott Stilfen, shortly after Space Chase's release, Selvo accepted a position with Apollo as the director of game development and was tasked with hiring 25 programmers across a swath of platforms. With these 4 June releases, we get our first look at some of these new game developers Selvo brought on board, as well as a couple more projects from Selvo himself. With that in mind, we'll start with his mostly solo project, Racquetball. Racquetball is a sport where 2 players take turns hitting a ball against a wall and returning it with their rackets, similar to other games like squash. This isn't exactly new for video games per se. There's a Studio 2 version of squash on its tennis cartridge, and even Atari's own Video Olympics cartridge from 1977 features a Pong-esque rendition under the name Handball. Apollo's game is thankfully fairly removed from Pong, as Selvo attempted to make a 3D view of the court. In his interview, Selvo didn't have too much to say about Racquetball outside of noting that Pat Roper was the one who came up with the idea for it. Byron Parks, the sound engineer who worked with Selvo on Space Chase, returned here for Racquetball, composing the opening theme song and many of the sound effects. Another Apollo programmer, Ernie Runyon, remembered Selvo putting in long hours on the game, working out trajectory and angles for the ball as it bounced around the wall, remarking that he was a genius for his skills in coming up with new methodology on the fly. Selvo estimated development time for it took about 4 weeks, a rapid production process that appears to have been a mandated staple for Apollo. And this rapid development process belies just how ambitious Racquetball is. The game's design, where the wall you're swinging at is in the background, puts it in the same realm as Alan Miller's basketball and tennis cartridges, which similarly attempted 3-dimensional spaces. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite nail the experience as well as either of those games. But before we delve into that, it's important to understand Racquetball's rules in play. Racquetball is for 1 or 2 players, with the single-player option pitting you against the computer. You can move around in all 8 directions on the floor of the playfield, closing in on the wall or backing away. The game opens with a cute little animation of the players entering the arena, shaking hands and taking their positions while an opening tune plays in the background. Much as in the actual sport, you need to hit the ball off the back wall before it touches the floor, at which point it is up to your opponent to return the ball by doing the same thing. The ball can and will bounce off the walls that surround you, changing course accordingly and casting shadows thanks to the 2 lights on the ceiling. These shadows are meant to help you align where you need to be on both the X and Y axes to return the ball, making them an integral part of succeeding in the game. Much as in Miller's tennis, while the button on the controller serves your initial shot, your player will automatically hit the ball in play once you are aligned with where it'll be based on the shadows. Points are earned when the ball bounces off the back wall before hitting the floor, and your opponent misses the return while you're the player that is serving. Otherwise, the serve goes to you with no points earned. The first player to get 21 points wins the contest. Racquetball's problems really stem from 2 things, the shadows themselves and the game's pace. Racquetball is extremely fast, and you have a pretty small window to react in order to return any kind of shot, which incidentally requires you to align the ball with your racket more than your player. Complicating things are all the shadows. While in theory you just need to line yourself up with the one along the floor and wait for the ball to approach on the y-axis, in practice this is pretty tricky and surprisingly unintuitive, as the shadows themselves are white just as the ball is. This leads to some visual clutter that makes it distracting to actually get into position or grasp where the ball actually is in relation to the world. It's disappointing as Racquetball has a lot going for it, but it is a brutal game to get the hang of. Once you do get a sense of how the shadows work and how the ball moves, it's fairly playable. The computer's serves actually only follow a few predetermined patterns, and once you figure out exactly where to return the ball, you can get a pretty good game out of it. Your opponent, it turns out, is not very good at catching the ball, either if you get some wild shots going. The color of the score bar on the bottom of the screen indicates whose turn it is to hit the ball, with yellow for player 1 and blue for player 2. This is actually pretty smart, as unless you figure this out, the game is even more chaotic. The difficulty switches let you adjust how accurate you can be with your shots, which, hey, if you're gotten to the point where you can demolish the computer with tricky shots it can't return, it does bring back the challenge. It may be overkill against another person, assuming you can find someone else who wants to play middling Atari VCS games decades later. And these same critiques came up time and again in Racquetball's contemporary coverage. Video Game Update praised its graphics, giving it 3 stars out of 4, but only 2.5 for gameplay. They indicated that the white shadows used for the ball make returning it confusing for newcomers given how fast the game is and how strong the computer opponent can be, making it better in 2-player mode. Video Gaming Illustrated marked it down as not recommended due to the distracting nature of the white shadows and the difficulty of judging where the ball was bouncing within the perspective of the game. Logical Gamer reviewed Racquetball in its second issue, and both reviewers were united in their appreciation for its visual fidelity and its bells and whistles with the opening song and handshake, but their praises ended there. The high speed and confusing nature of the shadows ultimately led both Alan and Mike to mark it down as a not recommended release. Joystick also negatively reviewed it in its How to Win at Video Games issue, saying that it's difficult to judge the location of your player and the ball, with the shadow hurting more than helping resolve that problem. Across the Atlantic, TV Gamer unusually described Racquetball as a fun to play, even if it isn't particularly faithful to the sport. Incredibly, Racquetball is not the only take of this sport on the VCS. In 1983, Avalon Hill published Wall Ball, a fairly obscure variation that mashes up Racquetball with Breakout. The resemblance didn't go unnoticed at the time. Video Game Illustrated's review of the game directly says that it is everything Apollo's Racquetball isn't, particularly in regards to the readability. Racquetball isn't necessarily a bad game, but it is one with some glaring flaws that likely could have been righted had the development process at Apollo not emphasized speed so heavily, which I'm afraid is true of most of their titles, even in this video. If you're willing to stick it out and understand how the game operates, it's fairly enjoyable, but the learning curve here is a steep one. Our next game, Lost Luggage, is a far less punishing, and still pretty charming game compared to Racquetball. Here the player controls 1 or 2 people at an airport responsible for grabbing luggage flying off of the carousel. Missing a piece of luggage will cause it to land on the floor and pop open, and once this happens 3 times, the game ends. If this setup sounds familiar, you're not wrong. While Lost Luggage is unique in terms of its theme, its basic game concept harkens back to Activision's Kaboom, or by proxy, Atari's arcade game Avalanche. And much like those games, the action here gets pretty frenetic after a few waves. But it's unfair to call this a real clone of those titles, as the gameplay differences are fairly significant. For one, the game uses a joystick, not the paddle controllers found in Kaboom or Avalanche. To make up for the fact that you don't have the same level of precision and speed as you would with a paddle, you have free movement within the game space in all 8 directions. While ideally you're catching luggage as it comes off the belt before it starts spreading out across the bottom of the screen, this means you have some wiggle room to chase down items that may have gotten past you, or push upwards and try to grab everything early. Lost Luggage comes to us from both Ed Salvo and a new face, Ernie Runyon. In a 2012 interview with Scott Stilfen, Runyon explained that he had recently been laid off from a retail sales catalog company called Arden. Needing to support his wife and children, and also having some experience with computer operations and assembly language from his university days, he took a tip from his brother-in-law to move to Texas and found a job at Apollo, only a mile away from their home, where he was hired in March 1982 as their 4th programming staff member. For Runyon's first and only released VCS game, Salvo presented him with a concept of an airport luggage carousel spewing forth people's clothes and underwear, and he shared a sketch of his idea. Salvo in turn told Stilfen in his 2006 interview that he got the idea while waiting at the Dallas-Fort Worth airport for his luggage and seeing the carousel continue to turn around. Yet this doesn't quite match the details he gave Rawson Stovell for his book, VidKid's Book of Home Video Games. There, Salvo specifically remembered the concept first coming to him in December 1981, as he and his wife flew home from his interview with Pat Roper. The plane had a stopover in St. Louis, he said then, and they watched as the baggage handling machine started dropping suitcases everywhere. In either event, Runyon recalls there being a brutal 4 to 6 week turnaround time for games expected at Apollo, requiring the team to pull some very late hours. Salvo did some of the game programming himself, with Runyon recalling that it took him about a week to get the collision and movement working right. Runyon did all the graphics, while another programmer, Larry Miner, handled the audio. Miner had been a COBOL programmer, as recalled by Apollo developer Dan Oliver, who had previously worked on a project for the Blue Cross that had cratered. This also included another theme song that plays during the game's introduction, much as in Racquetball. At the conclusion, the team brainstormed a name for the title, throwing around ideas like Airport Mayhem before finally landing on Lost Luggage. While the game card is pretty packed, Runyon recalled wanting to add in luggage trains as well, but not being able to work those in within the 4 kilobyte space limitations. And within those 4 kilobytes, the team managed to include some interesting options and a lot of personality. The difficulty switches adjust whether or not you control 1 or 2 people trying to catch luggage. 2 people are obviously better than 1, but it is also very easy for bags to slip between the 2 if you aren't careful. The game also includes options for the standard 2-player alternating mode and one with controllable luggage, where the other player is able to direct which way bags go flying off the carousel when it isn't their turn. Finally, there's the terrorist suitcase game option, where periodically a black suitcase containing a bomb will come off the carousel, and if you let it hit the ground, it'll explode and immediately end your game, regardless of how many lives you have stockpiled. A strange option in isolation, it's worth remembering that it wasn't unheard of at the time for planes to be the targets of hijackings, and airport security was practically non-existent in general in this pre-9/11 era. There are all sorts of other bells and whistles too. The carousel has a light that blinks on and off while it's active. Planes fly by in the background and will land to signal a new wave. And there's all sorts of goofy items that will pop out of the suitcases whenever one hits the ground. Additionally, there are 2 different versions of the game. The one found on Blue Label cartridges includes a little animation of your character grabbing suitcases that serve as your lives and placing them on the bottom of the screen, and it removes the ability to reset your game with the controller button even during gameplay. It also features some minor scoring changes. While the Green Label version gives you 3 points per suitcase, this is raised up to 4 points in the Blue Label, giving you a slightly better chance of earning an extra life, which occurs when the hundreds digit reaches either 4 or an 8. Runyon wasn't able to provide much insight into these differences as he left Apollo shortly after Lost Luggage's release, but speculated that Salvo had continued working on the game after they'd met their deadline to get it out the door, and was able to add in some extra features and rule tweaks that later runs included. Lost Luggage is a pretty tricky game regardless of the ROM revision you're playing. The joystick is obviously a lot more sensitive than a paddle, so it's pretty easy to overshoot your target, but it's equally easy to get into an impossible situation where you cannot grab all the bags in time. It's a game that begs for Atari trackball support, but unfortunately that hadn't been released for the VCS by this point in time, nor has anyone gone and hacked the game to add it. The terrorist bag is a fun wrinkle, but in my experience you can play around it just by prioritizing those bags in situations where you know something is going to hit a wall or the ground. The visual elements are really nice, from the colors used in the sky to the array of items that will pop out of the luggage when it pops open, and much like Racquetball, the opening song is a nice touch. It would just be nice if the game had been reworked to use the paddle controllers, even if only as an option. Surprisingly, Runyon was able to share an unused ad jingle written by Byron Parks for Lost Luggage. As Runyon remembered, Pat Roper was interested in expanding Apollo's advertising and was looking for material, so Parks put together a little song as a pitch for Apollo's sound studios. Runyon didn't remember what this was intended to be used for, but it's a fairly unique piece of history for Apollo. Lost Luggage was recognized in reviews for its comedic efforts. The video magazine Arcade Alley review saw Arnie Katz and Bill Kunkel critique it as a game with cute touches and humor that ultimately could have used some more complex gameplay elements to really shine. This was elaborated on further in Electronic Games, where they noted the Kaboom similarities and how featureless the play area appears compared to the plane landing, conveyor belt, and suitcase animations. Lou Hudson reviewed it in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, giving it high marks for the concept but dings it for how quickly the difficulty spikes. This was largely because of the joystick controls making it difficult to catch all the suitcases after a few waves, requiring you to memorize the baggage pattern. Playboy's Guide to Electronic Entertainment called out Lost Luggage for its bizarre fun theme and Kaboom-esque play. Joystick called Game 4 the most fun variation for its terrorist suitcase and recommended approaching it like tennis, focusing on sticking close to the center. Logical Gamer's reviewers praised its novelty value and suggested that if you don't have Kaboom, this is a good alternative, with the added note that the reviewer's 4-year-old really enjoyed it. The second reviewer did take umbrage with the controller button resetting the game even while you're still playing it, which, again, was fixed in the later ROM revision. TV Gamer echoed Logical Gamer's description of it as ideal for kids, but said Kaboom would likely be preferable for older players. While we can't say anything about how well Lost Luggage sold, Runyon remembered being sent out to buy some office equipment after the game had come out and seeing it on store shelves just as a woman was buying it for her kid. After the store manager mentioned he was the author, she had him sign the box, which he felt embarrassed by. Runyon decided that he was better suited for organizational structuring than programming, and after a failed attempt at starting a computer game venture, he went into data processing for the city of Fort Worth, and then moved out east to Virginia. His career bounced him around the country in various roles before he retired around 2001, but he never returned to video games, save for developing a Missile Command clone / graphics tutorial for the Atari 800 and Commodore 64 that he called Silo Defense. This was sold to a now unknown computer magazine and is, as of this recording, a lost program. Still, Lost Luggage is a very solid, visually and aurally impressive game for the VCS, even if it's not a standout in the play department. Like most of Apollo's output, it likely could have used a more time for fine-tuning, but it's perfectly enjoyable. Our third game this video is Apollo's best reviewed game of these four, and for a very good reason. Space Cavern, written by Dan Oliver, was conceived by Pat Roper as a clone of Imagic's critical darling, Demon Attack. Ed Salvo remembered Pat Roper flying him out to the Winter Consumer Electronics Show and seeing Demon Attack on display, with Roper coming away deeply impressed and wanting a game just like it. Once Oliver came on, he remembered Roper describing a game he'd seen at CES that everyone considered the best game of the show, at least graphically. Not long after, Roper plopped a copy of Demon Attack on Oliver's desk and asked him to make something like it. Oliver remembered Roper indicating it was very difficult to get a copy that early, and suspected he may have gotten it from a distributor contact. Oliver said in his Musings on Atari Compendium from 2013, as well as an Atari 2600 Connection interview from 1997, that he had some background in computers before interviewing at Apollo, being a college student who had largely been wire wrapping RAM by hand, and that he'd gotten to mess with microcomputers in the university lab. He'd also purchased himself an Apple II and had started learning 6502 assembly, and decided to apply for part-time work at Apollo to see what was happening in the video game industry. While Oliver interviewed more as an artist given his background in making and selling oil paintings, he mentioned he'd be willing to give a game a shot, and ended up being hired in at $16,000 a year. A few short days later, Roper approached him about copying Demon Attack. Oliver said he downloaded the Demon Attack data off the cart and set about seeing how everything worked, using a manual Salvo had put together to assist. This was, he added, how most folks at Apollo learned to code for the VCS hardware, by studying the code and learning how other games had been put together. Oliver had no experience with the VCS before working at Apollo, and seeing that many games advertised having tons of game modes and options with some minor code tweaks stuck with him early on. Oliver mused that the main thing he was tasked with were having great graphics, not necessarily just completely cloning Demon Attack. On that front, he felt like he had come up short, though Space Cavern is still a pretty good-looking game. Oliver added that he felt it never came close to matching Demon Attack, though he did add a few things to give his own twist on the formula. Said he was rushed to finish the game within 4 weeks as Roper had already sold 75,000 copies to the distributors, wrapping up the final fixes after essentially working on it 24/7 that entire time. He remembered driving the 55 miles back home to Denton to celebrate with his wife and some friends with a night on the town, and receiving a phone call at one of the bars that they'd visited close to midnight, letting him know that there was a bug in the game, and that they needed him to come back to fix it. He was, of course, way too drunk to do so, and so headed back in the morning, quite hungover, to find that he had backed up the wrong version and had lost all the bug fixes he'd done the previous day. A few hours later, the production line was humming, and Space Cavern started shipping out. Unlike most of Apollo's games at this point, the manual provides you with a little sci-fi story blurb. As the commander of a Mark 14 Star Cruiser, you've landed on an uncharted world riddled with caverns and caves. These are occupied by flying electrosauri capable of firing electric blasts, as well as shaggy marsupials you have to try and avoid as well. Large electrosauri are worth 115 points, while the smaller ones are worth 165, and the shaggy marsupials that attack from the sides are worth 200 points if you catch them with your shot. Every 20,000 points, you earn an extra life. Space Cavern features a whopping 48 game modes, as Oliver took to heart how many variations existing VCS titles tended to have. The game modes addressed whether or not you have to deal with the shaggy marsupials, if you're fending off 2 or 4 Electrosauri at a time, and whether or not their bullets will randomly shift direction, as though a force of wind was blowing them all one way or another, all of which can be played with 1 or 2 players. There are also options for 3 different difficulty levels, and the difficulty switches themselves adjust how often the Electrosauri fire at you. If you get good at this game, there are a lot of ways to challenge yourself. Roper asked Oliver to do something in the vein of Demon Attack, and Oliver clearly understood the assignment. For being his first game, and one he had to jam out in a month, Space Cavern is remarkably solid. The movement of the Electrosauri in particular feels good to fight against compared to Apollo's earlier shooter Space Chase, and while they're not as varied as the foes you face in Demon Attack, they provide an ample challenge. Upping their numbers from 2 to 4 introduces a fair bit of flicker, but also makes for a much more chaotic experience as you try to weave through thickets of electric blasts to fire back at them. This is one of those rare games that lets you negate enemy shots with your own if you manage to align them, and that can save your hide in those instances. The shaggy marsupials are an interesting quirk, but even in game modes where they are active, they don't necessarily show up that often. It very much comes across as them coming out in droves and then stopping entirely for a while. If there is something to ding about this game, it's how readily you can get zapped spawning in on a life. Even just starting the game can sometimes see you die immediately as a marsupial or stray shot hits you before you can react. Nevertheless, this remains probably the strongest title in Apollo's lineup to date. The best strategy for the game, as described in electronic games, is to try and maintain position near the center of the screen, as that gives you ample opportunity to blast the marsupials coming in from the sides. This is counter to other shooters that want you to maneuver around the play area, especially since your shots are fast enough that you don't really need to lead on them. Reviews for Space Cavern were largely positive, though its control scheme was a little divisive. In video, Kunkel and Katz remarked that this really came across as a skill contest that takes some practice to get the hang of, particularly with the unusual control scheme for firing horizontally. Lou Hudson wrote that it was the best Space Invaders derivative yet, surpassing Demon Attack in pure action and calling out Game 47 in particular as nightmarishly difficult. Electronic Games also gave Space Cavern the runner-up award for Best Action Game in the 1983 Archie Awards, describing it as a slam-bang action game of the highest caliber. Joystick, on the flip side, judged the game poorly, with splashy graphics but predictable gameplay. TV Gamer also gave it some negative remarks, writing that aside from the enemies coming from the sides, it's a pretty mindless experience. Space Cavern did apparently do well for Apollo, as Oliver remembered it selling $1.5 million worth in the first few months, and seemingly it was the only game of theirs that got a TV advertisement. It did wind up being the only game he'd do for Apollo, however. Not long after he'd finished the game, he saw an article in Forbes about how much money there was to be made in the industry, and how game creators could be considered artists in their own right who have been demanding recognition. While Larry Miner had successfully lobbied for pay raises and people getting their names on the game boxes, which never did end up happening, Oliver also saw red flags in Pat Roper's growth plans and ideas for personal helicopters, and this all led him to putting in his 2-week notice and leaving Apollo. This isn't the last we'll see of Oliver, though, as not long after, he applied at and was hired in at another Texas-based game company, Venture Vision, producing a game we'll see at the tail end of 1982 that it is an absolute gem for the platform. Our final game this video is Lochjaw, which you may also know under the name Shark Attack. Lochjaw comes to us from Steve Stringfellow, another new hire at Apollo, and is a part of the long tradition of man-eating shark games that dates back to the mid-1970s. You can pin this particular trend on a little movie called Jaws, which came out in 1975. Jaws was a massive success and has been pointed to as an early example of a blockbuster movie. While its legacy includes a series of sequels, a new approach to marketing films, and a massive spike in violence against sharks, it also inspired a series of bald-faced knockoff video games in the coin-op space. 3 came out in rapid succession. Possibly the most technically unique was Maneater from Project Service Engineering, or PSE. According to historian Keith Smith's unpublished book, All in Color for a Quarter, the company got its start in 1973 to support electronics companies with contract work and formed a games division the following year, Company president John Chaudhry saw Jaws in July 1975 and raced back to his workshop to develop a game based on the movie, which debuted at the October MOA show in a delightful shark-shaped cabinet. Here players took on the role of divers seeking treasure while avoiding the two sharks swimming around the screen. If a diver was caught, the machine would play a pre-recorded scream off a tape inside the cabinet. A mere month before the MOA show, Atari, through a subsidiary called Horror Games, debuted Shark Jaws, with all the emphasis on the Jaws part of the name. This one had your diver spearing fish while avoiding the hungry shark, and the marquee, with shark in very tiny typeface and Jaws in massive letters, apparently drew the ire of Universal MCA's legal department, which took all of 3 days to determine Atari was actually behind Horror Games. Finally, US Billiards produced a game called simply Shark around the same time as Atari's take. Here you controlled the shark, avoiding traps and nets as you pursue a swimmer heading for shore, with the winner being whoever eats 5 swimmers first. Taito published Blue Shark in 1978, a Seawolf clone that replaced the ships with sea creatures, and your periscope with a harpoon. In 1980, Pacific Novelty came out with Philip Lieberman's Deep Death, later renamed to Shark Attack, a shark-themed game also inspired by Jaws where the player controlled the shark and had to fend off squadrons of divers. The game was modestly successful, but Pacific Novelty was too small an outfit to really produce enough to reach demand. And that brings us to Lochjaw, another game where you have divers and sharks. According to the manual, the setup for Lochjaw has you diving into shark-infested waters to claim the treasures of a sunken 16th century Spanish galleon, while avoiding both these territorial, predatory fish and, inexplicably, the Loch Ness Monster, which apparently has relocated from its freshwater home in Scotland to the ocean, and also, hence the name, Lochjaw. In practice, this is a maze chase game in the vein of Pac-Man. Your diver swims through this kelp maze gathering diamonds that then must be deposited within the shark cage in the middle of the screen. The sharks aren't bound by the walls of the maze, unlike the enemies in most of these kinds of games, and furthermore will also eat diamonds. Nevertheless, you can protect yourself from the sharks if you are inside the shark cage with the doors closed. Nessie presents a different challenge. It lurks in one of the 4 warp caves in the corners, and will emerge every so often, giving chase to your diver. The only way to shake Nessie is to enter a different cave as it nears you, at which point it will hopefully follow you and return to its slumber. The shark cage does not present any sort of protection. The original Lochjaw manual suggests that sharks can be fended off by picking up and using a shark prod, but this doesn't exist in the released game, and the section was removed from the later Shark Attack printings entirely. With this setup, there are a surprising number of variations on the cartridge, a total of 16, with the options arranged for 1 or 2 players. The shark cage is the central component of many of these game modes, as the door either is controlled by the player, is always open, rotates, or randomly opens and shuts. The actual diamond gathering action is also a variable. Gobble games work similar to Pac-Man, where you just grab as many gems as you can and toss them in the shark cage to add to your permanent score. The pick-em-up modes, on the other hand, only allow you to grab 1 diamond at a time, which then must be deposited in the shark cage. The only way you get permanent points in this game mode is when you're eaten by a shark or when the maze is cleared. The difficulty switches adjust how quickly your diver swims, and every 100 points, you get another life. Unfortunately, we don't know too much about Lochjaw's development. While I did successfully get in touch with Stringfellow, we hadn't completed our interview in time for this video, so I'll see if I can't get those details out at a later date. Stringfellow does appear in the PM Magazine feature about Apollo, where Lisa Gibbons tried out an in-development version of the game and Stringfellow shows off some items from a previous build. There, he mentioned that they'd gone through about 20 iterations of the diver over its then 4-week development period before coming up with one everyone was satisfied with, adding that initially it looked more like a spider. At that stage, there was no hit detection program for the shark, though the game largely resembles the finished product, visually speaking. As is kind of the trend for Apollo titles at this point, Lochjaw is visually appealing, but also possesses some glaring flaws that probably could have been worked out with more time. For starters, it's extremely easy to get hung up on the walls of the maze. Exactly how easy depends on the revision of the game, more on that later. But it is a problem regardless of what version of Lochjaw you play. The sharks are also fairly unpredictable, and coupled with the navigation issues and their increasing speed as you get further in the game, you can pretty easily wind up in a situation where you have no chance to get out of the way. Meanwhile, Nessie can be a threat if you're in a bad position on the map, or if your cave ploy doesn't work out, but it otherwise just kind of wanders around without zeroing in on your diver. which brings the actual gameplay to a standstill until you can lure it off the playfield. The gobble game modes where you deposit diamonds in the shark cage are still reasonably entertaining, but the pick-em-up game modes are rather dreary, as you have to swim around grabbing one gem at a time and taking it back to the center of the screen. If you couple that mode with the slower swim speed option, you're either probably something of a masochist or a very bored child. Much as with some of these other early shark games, the Lochjaw name caught the attention of Universal MCA. The game appears to have initially gone on sale in June, gaining unwanted legal attention almost immediately, and Apollo settled with the movie company by early July to rename the game to Shark Attack. MCA, it turns out, had licensed the Jaws rights to Parker Brothers to make home video games, though Parker Brothers never actually produced any games with it. Pat Roper was quoted in Electronic Games as saying that while he didn't think it was infringing, Apollo was too busy at the time to get involved in litigation, and therefore changing the name was easier. As a result, Lockjaw carts with the original title were recognized very early on as being both rare and collectible. That said, even within the fairly limited production run of Lockjaw, there are some minor program differences, and further ones with Shark Attack. While the most obvious ones include little visual touches such as the locations of the clouds and whether or not the trees on the surface sway in the breeze, there are also bug fixes. It's possible to get stuck in the kelp in Lockjaw much more easily than in the later Shark Attack version, making it more of a chore to actually play through, though hilariously if you get stuck on a diamond, sometimes the game will just start collecting them endlessly until you die or the game is reset. As such, if you actually want to play the game, Shark Attack is probably the better revision, though you do lose some of the graphical touches. Lockjaw / Shark Attack, like most of Apollo's games, saw reasonably decent reviews, but nothing earth-shattering. Joyce Worley reviewed it in Arcade Express, indicating that it was a difficult game to master, but one she found worthwhile, giving it a 7 out of 10. The video game update gave it 2 stars for graphics and 1.5 for gameplay, complaining about how muddled the graphics are for keeping the diver off the walls, and calling the joystick controls frustrating. Logical Gamer gave it diametrically opposing reviews, with one reviewer describing it as a pleasant and inventive twist on Pac-Man with lovely graphics, and the other complaining about the diver's mobility and how readily they get caught on the walls. Joystick's How to Win at Video Games reviewed Shark Attack fairly negatively, specifically calling out the gobble game mode as a boring, unoriginal experience, and adding that coupled with the sticky walls, it's better to just play something like Pac-Man. UK Magazine TV Gamer praised it as one of the best games to come out of Apollo, amusingly suggesting that it takes place in Loch Ness and due to Nessie's presence. Much later, a Digital Press fanzine review noted that Shark Attack fixed the sticky wall problem seen in Lockjaw, but either way the game is visually appealing and well animated. Stringfellow doesn't appear to have worked on any other games at Apollo that we know of as of this recording, though one could probably guess that, like Runyon and Oliver, he likely decided that this just wasn't for him, or at least Apollo's high-intensity, rapid turnaround approach to game development. The Apollo roller coaster still has several more games and about 5 more months of 1982 before it comes to a crashing end amidst a financial mess involving unpaid marketing bills, but this grouping really showcases the company's house style. Visually striking, but often undercooked. With us reaching the end of June, I think it's time for another installment of Crash Watch. Since our last edition closing out March 1982, there's continued proof that consumers are hotly demanding video games, with a merchandising survey published in its May edition finding nearly 20% of households had a game system already, and another 9% planning on buying one that year. And Atari dominating, with 70% of the game-owning public having a VCS. Commensurate with these trends, the market has continued to explode financially. Toys R Us reported that in the first quarter of 1982, game sales had jumped 186% to $27.7 million. And these dollar signs did their part in drawing in new competitors and a lot of new licensing agreements for TV, movie, comic book, and coin-op properties. Several new companies have announced plans to begin releasing games for home consoles. Parker Brothers made its initial announcement at the February Toy Fair with licensed games, but it wasn't alone. CBS's toy subsidiary Gabriel Industries announced plans to enter the video game market in April, with a 4-year exclusive deal to make home ports of arcade games from Midway, which it would do on the Atari VCS, the 5200, and various computer platforms. At the same time, CBS purchased international distributor Ideal Toy to give it an edge in other parts of the globe. Around the same time, Emerson Radio announced plans to produce a home video game console, unveiling it at the June Consumer Electronics Show. This ended up being the Arcadia 2001, the US version of a console standard that seemingly originated in Hong Kong and showed up all over the globe. This was part of the company's move beyond simply audio equipment, as it also intended on releasing Emerson-branded televisions and felt that these moves could lead it to entering the computer space. Quaker Oats also announced in April that it had purchased US Games to enter the video game field, as previously discussed in the Space Jockey episode of Atari Archive. This isn't as left field as you'd think, as Quaker Oats already owned toy company Fisher-Price, to which US Games would serve as a subsidiary. By the time CES rolled around in June, Tiger Electronics, Spectravision, 20th Century Fox, Jensen, Arcadia, known shortly afterwards as Starpath, and Telesystems all announced console game plans, while GCE unveiled the Vectrex console at the show itself. Paramount, then owner of Sega Enterprises, also announced its own plans to work with Coleco on games, presumably explaining why several Sega arcade titles showed up on ColecoVision. And speaking of the ColecoVision, Coleco started production on the console in June, eyeballing the first deliveries to hit regional stores in July. Atari itself made several announcements, including System X, their next-gen console, and licensing agreements for games based on the movies Kroll and E.T., and Centuri's arcade titles such as Vanguard and Phoenix. Meanwhile, there are some warning signs about the overheating coin-op game marketplace, which would see its own version of the crash in 1983. Warner announced it expected only modest growth in this part of its business for 1982, with some areas simply being overbuilt and overstocked on units. Japanese game designs were becoming a hotter commodity on top of that for American companies to license, following successes such as Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, Frogger, and Scramble. But increasingly this meant a lot more games were coming over that weren't breakout hits. And on another front, the home computer market was still absolutely minuscule, with an estimated 2 million households having one, though an impending price war would help buff those numbers. Commodore announced new mass-market retail partners for its VIC-20 computer beginning in June, including Montgomery Ward, Toys R Us, Kmart, and Service Merchandise, while Timex announced plans to take the Sinclair ZX81 budget computer starting in July at a retail price of about $100. Commodore also announced its Commodore 64 was going to be priced at $600 and debut in August, pushing Apple to cut $600 off the price of an Apple II, though this only brought the price down to about $2,000 for a fully equipped unit. Small wonder that between all of these consoles and computers that trade media was reporting on how crowded the space was for all these disparate hardware standards, with the big three of the VCS, Intellivision Odyssey 2, joined by 3 new companies, Atari's own successor platform, the 5200, and old mainstay platforms Channel F and Bally Arcade hanging in there. By May and June, there were already some warning signs from retailers and industry professionals about oversaturation, as it happened to the handheld game market in 1980, with Toys R Us president Norman Ricken cautioning against overstocking generic titles. Spirits were riding high at the June CES show in Chicago. Given the dour news dropping in December from Warner's quarterly financial report, it will be the last one with such unbridled excitement for quite some time. Next time, we're playing defense against overwhelming odds.